The night air hung thick and cold over the barbed wire fortress, carrying with it the desperate whispers of men who knew their time was running out. In the winter of 1944, somewhere along the Eastern Front, where the Third Reich's grip was beginning to crack, a single beam of light from a guard tower swept methodically across a frozen killing zone. But on this particular night, that light would do something it was never designed to do. It would turn away at the exact moment when 3 prisoners pressed a pair of stolen wire cutters against the fence that separated them from freedom or death. The guard in that tower knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that one order, one shout, one burst from his machine gun would end those men in seconds. Instead, he pointed his searchlight in the opposite direction and pretended not to hear the soft metallic clicks cutting through the silence. This is the story of a man whose name has been erased from history, a Wehrmacht soldier who chose humanity over duty in a system designed to crush both. By the end of this video, you will understand why his act of mercy was more dangerous than any battlefield heroism, and why the truth of what happened that night was buried for 80 years. The camp sat on the outskirts of a small town whose residents had learned to ignore the columns of emaciated prisoners shuffling past their windows each morning. It was not one of the death camps that would later define the horror of the Nazi regime, but it was not a place of mercy either. This was a labor camp, a gear in the vast machine of exploitation that fed the German war effort with broken bodies and stolen lives. Prisoners here were worked until they collapsed, fed just enough to continue working, and executed the moment they became more trouble than they were worth. The guards were a mix of hardened SS enforcers and regular Wehrmacht soldiers who had been assigned to rear echelon duty, men too old or too wounded for the front lines. Most had accepted their role with the cold efficiency that the regime demanded. They had families to protect, orders to follow, and the ever-present threat of being sent east to the meat grinder if they showed weakness. But among these men stood one whose conscience had not yet been fully suffocated by the machinery of totalitarianism. His name has been lost to time, buried in the chaos of Germany's collapse and the deliberate destruction of records that followed. What we know comes from the testimony of survivors, fragments of evidence pieced together decades after the war, and the faded memory of a single photograph found in a military archive. He was in his mid-30s, too old for the glory of blitzkrieg but young enough to be useful. Before the war, he had been a teacher in Bavaria, a man who loved literature and believed in the power of education to elevate the human spirit. When conscription came, he had no choice but to serve. By 1943, after a wound to his leg left him with a permanent limp, he was assigned to guard duty at this nameless camp. The other guards called him the Professor, sometimes with affection, sometimes with contempt. He kept to himself, did his shifts without complaint, and never participated in the beatings that punctuated life behind the wire. Winter brought a new level of desperation to the camp. Food rations were cut as the Eastern Front devoured resources. The Red Army was advancing, and rumors spread among the prisoners that liberation might be coming. But liberation was still months away, and for many months meant death. 3 prisoners, Polish resistance fighters captured during the Warsaw Uprising, decided they could not wait. They had been planning their escape for weeks, hoarding scraps of metal, studying the guard rotations, waiting for the right moment. They knew the tower positions, knew the searchlight patterns, knew that the gap between sweeps was exactly 43 seconds. What they did not know was whether the guard in the northern tower would pull the trigger when he saw them. They had watched him for days, noticed his hesitation, the way he sometimes turned his light away from certain areas. They gambled everything on the hope that he was different. The night of the escape arrived under a moonless sky, the kind of darkness that felt like a gift from God or a trap from the devil. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and the ground was hard as iron beneath a thin layer of frost. The 3 men waited until the first shift change, when guards were tired and distracted. They crawled on their bellies across the open ground, dragging themselves through frozen mud toward the outer fence. The wire cutters, fashioned from a stolen piece of railway track and sharpened against concrete over countless nights, felt impossibly heavy in their hands. Every sound seemed amplified, every breath a scream. The searchlight from the northern tower began its sweep, the beam cutting through the darkness like a white blade. The men pressed themselves flat against the earth, hearts hammering, waiting for the burst of gunfire that would end their lives. The light moved closer, closer, and then stopped. For 3 eternal seconds, the beam hung in the air 20 feet to their left, illuminating nothing but empty ground. Then it swung away back toward the western perimeter, as if the guard had seen something that demanded his attention elsewhere. The prisoners did not waste the gift they had been given. Wire by wire they cut through the fence, the soft pings of breaking metal swallowed by the wind. They crawled through the gap, across the outer perimeter, and into the tree line beyond. Behind them, the searchlight continued its careful dance, always looking in the wrong direction, always giving them just enough time. The guard in the tower never moved his machine gun. He never raised the alarm. He simply stood in his post, his hand steady on the searchlight controls, and watched 3 men run toward a freedom he would never know. By morning, the escape would be discovered. By noon, there would be an investigation, and by nightfall, the guard who had been on duty in the northern tower would face questions that could cost him everything. But on this night, in this moment, he had made a choice that defined him more than any oath or uniform ever could. The discovery came at dawn, when the morning roll call revealed 3 empty spaces in the lineup. The camp commandant, a career SS officer named Möller, who measured his worth in the efficiency of his cruelty, immediately ordered a lockdown. Prisoners were forced to stand at attention in the frozen courtyard for 6 hours, while guards searched every barracks, every latrine, every shadow where a man might hide. When the cut fence was finally discovered, Möller's rage turned the camp into a theater of terror. He ordered 20 prisoners selected at random and shot in front of the assembled inmates as punishment for the escape. Their bodies were left in the courtyard for 3 days as a reminder of what defiance cost. But even as the blood froze on the ground, Möller's attention turned to a question that consumed him. How had 3 men crossed the killing zone without being seen? How had they cut through 2 fences during the night shift without triggering a single alarm? Someone had failed, someone had looked away, and someone would pay. The investigation began immediately, with a methodical brutality that defined the Nazi bureaucratic machine. Every guard who had been on duty that night was interrogated separately. Their shift logs were examined down to the minute. Their positions were cross-referenced with the timeline of the escape. Möller brought in Gestapo investigators from the regional headquarters, men trained to find guilt in silence and treason in hesitation. The guards understood what was at stake. Failure to prevent an escape was dereliction of duty, punishable by court-martial and execution. Aiding an escape, even through negligence, was considered treason against the Reich. The punishment for treason was always the same: a firing squad if you were lucky, the camps if you were not. The professor stood among his fellow guards during the interrogations, his face a mask of careful neutrality, his mind racing through every second of that night. The searchlight logs became the focus of the investigation. Each tower kept a written record of their sweep patterns, noting any anomalies or suspicious activity. The professor had been meticulous in his documentation, recording his observations with the precision of the teacher he once was. But precision could also reveal gaps. The investigators noticed that during the estimated time of the escape, the northern tower searchlight had been directed toward the western perimeter for an unusually long period. When questioned, the professor explained that he had seen movement near the vehicle depot and had maintained focus on that area to investigate. He had found nothing, he reported, and had resumed normal patrol patterns. His explanation was plausible. His record was clean. But one of the Gestapo men, a thin-faced investigator with cold grey eyes, was not satisfied. He had seen too many lies dressed up as duty, too many traitors hiding behind competence. The investigator began a shadow campaign to prove the professor's guilt. He interviewed other guards about the teacher's behavior, his attitudes, his political reliability. Most had nothing substantial to report. The professor did his job, followed orders, kept to himself. But one guard, a young fanatic named Werner who worshipped Hitler with the fervor of the converted, mentioned something that caught the investigator's attention. He said the professor had once stopped him from beating a prisoner who had collapsed during work detail. The professor had claimed the prisoner was more useful alive than dead, that killing him would reduce productivity. Werner had found the intervention strange, too rational, too concerned with the prisoner's welfare. It was a small thing, perhaps meaningless, but in a system where small mercies were treated as acts of sedition, it was enough to deepen suspicion. The pressure mounted slowly, like water rising behind a dam. The professor continued his shifts, maintained his routine, showed no outward sign of fear. But he knew the investigation was closing in. He knew that in a regime built on absolute obedience, even the appearance of doubt was dangerous. He had saved 3 lives that night, 3 men he would never meet, 3 futures he had given back to the world. Now he would discover if that act of grace would cost him everything. The next shift rotation was approaching, and the investigator had requested permission to observe the guard towers personally. The professor understood what that meant. He would be watched, tested, and if he hesitated even once, if his searchlight wavered in the wrong direction, the truth would reveal itself. The night the investigator came to observe, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The professor climbed the ladder to his tower at precisely 2100 hours, his leg aching from the cold and the wound that had saved him from the Eastern Front, but delivered him to this particular hell. The investigator stood at the base of the tower, smoking a cigarette and watching with those dead grey eyes that had sent countless men to their graves. The message was clear. Every movement would be scrutinized, every decision evaluated. The professor settled into his position, wrapped his hands around the searchlight controls, and began the methodical sweep that had become as automatic as breathing. But tonight, nothing could be automatic. Tonight, every choice carried the weight of his life hanging in the balance. He moved the light in perfect arcs, covered every meter of fence line, lingered on the suspicious areas that regulations demanded. He was a model of efficiency, a perfect instrument of the regime's will. 3 hours into the shift, a prisoner made a run for the fence. It was a moment of pure madness or pure desperation, a young man who had decided that a bullet was preferable to another day of slow starvation. He sprinted from the barracks toward the wire, his skeletal frame casting long shadows in the artificial light. The professor's searchlight found him instantly, locked onto his running figure with mechanical precision. Protocol was absolute. Illuminate the target, sound the alarm, fire if necessary. The machine gun mounted beside the searchlight was loaded and ready. The investigator below shouted up to the tower, his voice sharp with command and anticipation. This was the test. This was the moment that would prove loyalty or reveal treason. The professor's hand moved to the machine gun, his finger finding the trigger. Time stretched and compressed simultaneously. The prisoner was 20 meters from the fence. 15. 10. The professor fired. The burst of gunfire shattered the night, and the prisoner fell instantly, his body crumpling like a puppet with cut strings. The searchlight remained fixed on the motionless form as guards rushed across the killing zone to confirm what everyone already knew. The investigator climbed the tower ladder and stood beside the professor, studying his face for any trace of hesitation or regret. He found none. The professor stared straight ahead, his expression empty, his hands steady on the controls. The investigator nodded slowly, almost disappointed that his suspicions had found no confirmation. He asked if the professor had hesitated even for a moment. The response came immediately, mechanical, devoid of emotion. The prisoner was attempting escape. Regulations required immediate neutralization. There had been no hesitation. The investigator lingered for another moment, then descended the ladder without another word. The professor had passed the test. But the cost of that passage lay bleeding in the frozen mud below. What the investigator did not know, what no one could know, was that the professor had aimed low and to the right. The burst that appeared to kill the prisoner had in fact torn through his leg and shoulder, devastating wounds but not immediately fatal. The professor had seen the young man's trajectory, calculated the angles with the precision of his teaching days, and placed his shots where they would drop the target without destroying the vital organs. It was a gamble of millimeters and timing, a desperate attempt to satisfy the demands of the system while preserving a chance at survival. As the guards reached the body, one of them, an older Wehrmacht soldier who had seen too much death to care about protocol, noticed the prisoner was still breathing. He made a decision in that moment. Instead of delivering the finishing shot that regulations demanded, he ordered the body taken to the camp infirmary. The official report would list the prisoner as deceased. But in the chaos of wartime record-keeping, in the gap between official truth and actual reality, a young man would cling to life for 3 more weeks before dying of infection. 3 weeks that the professor had given him, 3 weeks that were both a mercy and a curse. The investigation quietly closed after that night. The professor had demonstrated his reliability under the most direct scrutiny possible. His service record was marked as exemplary. The Gestapo investigator moved on to other camps, other suspicions, other lives to destroy. But something had broken inside the professor that could never be repaired. He had killed to prove he was capable of killing. He had become the thing he despised to protect the secret of who he truly was. The 3 prisoners who had escaped were somewhere out there, alive because of his mercy. But the young man who had run toward the fence in a moment of desperation was dead because of his precision. The moral calculus was impossible to balance. He continued his shifts, continued his sweeps, continued to be the perfect instrument of a machine built on human suffering. And he began to plan for the next opportunity, knowing that redemption, if it existed at all, could only be found in the repetition of grace. Spring arrived late in 1945, bringing with it the sound of distant artillery that grew louder with each passing week. The Red Army was advancing faster than German command had believed possible, swallowing territory in great hungry gulps that brought the front lines closer to the camp with each dawn. The guards could hear the thunder of Soviet guns during their night shifts, a low rumbling promise that the war was entering its final phase. Panic began to infect the camp administration. Orders came from Berlin, demanding that evidence be destroyed, that certain prisoners be liquidated before liberation could turn them into witnesses. The Commandant Müller grew increasingly erratic, ordering executions for minor infractions, screaming about traitors and defeatists among his own men. The professor watched this disintegration with careful attention, understanding that chaos created opportunities. In the collapsing architecture of Nazi authority, the rigid protocols that had nearly cost him his life were beginning to fracture. Small acts of mercy became possible in the widening cracks of a dying regime. The camp population had swelled with prisoners evacuated from facilities closer to the advancing front. They arrived in cattle cars, more dead than alive, their bodies testifying to the accelerating brutality of a regime that knew its time was ending. Among the new arrivals were Jews from the eastern camps, political prisoners from Poland, captured partisans from Ukraine, and French resistance fighters who had been transferred from prisons in the west. The barracks were overcrowded beyond capacity, with men sleeping in shifts because there was no longer room for everyone to lie down simultaneously. Disease spread through the camp like wildfire. Dysentery, typhus, and tuberculosis killed dozens every week. The crematorium could not keep pace with the dead, and bodies began to accumulate in a warehouse that had once stored construction materials. The professor saw faces in those crowds that reminded him of his former students, young men who had believed in books and ideas and the possibility of a better world. Now they were numbers, skeletal shadows waiting for death or liberation, whichever arrived first. The commandant received new orders in early April. The camp was to be evacuated within 72 hours. All prisoners capable of walking would be marched west, away from the Soviet advance. Those too weak to march would be shot. The guards understood what this meant. It was a death march, a final act of extermination disguised as military necessity. Thousands would die on the roads, shot for falling behind or simply collapsing from exhaustion. Those who survived the march would be dumped into other camps already overflowing with the dying. The professor listened to these orders during the morning briefing and felt something crystallize inside him. He had been waiting for a moment, a single clear opportunity to act without the scrutiny that had nearly destroyed him. This chaos, this desperate scramble to hide evidence and move human cargo, was that moment. The regime was dying, and in its death throes, the machinery of surveillance was breaking down. Guards were deserting. Officers were destroying documents and preparing to flee. In this collapse, a man could act according to his conscience and perhaps survive to see the consequences. The professor began making quiet contact with other guards who he suspected shared his growing disgust. There were more than he expected, men who had joined out of necessity rather than conviction, soldiers who had watched the slow moral degradation of their country and wanted no part of its final crimes. They met in twos and threes, speaking in careful euphemisms, testing each other's commitment. One was a former police officer from Hamburg who had children the same age as many of the prisoners. Another was a farmer from Saxony who had been conscripted at 40 and wanted only to return to his land. A third was an Austrian who despised the Prussian arrogance that had consumed his homeland. They did not call themselves resistors or conspirators. They simply agreed that when the evacuation began, they would create opportunities for escape. They would slow the march. They would look the other way at critical moments. They would fail to notice prisoners slipping into the woods. It was not organized resistance. It was a patchwork of individual mercies stitched together by men who had decided that following orders into hell was no longer acceptable. The night before the evacuation was to begin, the professor climbed to his tower for what he knew would be one of his final shifts. The Soviet guns were close enough now that he could see flashes on the horizon, brief flowers of light blooming and fading in the darkness. Liberation was perhaps a week away, maybe less, but for the prisoners scheduled to march at dawn, a week was an eternity they would never reach. He adjusted the searchlight, began his sweep and waited. He had learned from his mistake with the young man who had run at the fence. This time, when the moment came, there would be no half measures. This time, when prisoners made their move toward freedom, his light would not just look away. It would guide them. He would transform the instrument of their imprisonment into a beacon pointing toward survival. The risk was absolute. If he was caught, he would die. But the cost of doing nothing, of being complicit in one final massacre, was something he could no longer bear. The evacuation began at dawn with the kind of organized brutality that had defined the Reich until its final hours. Prisoners were roused from the barracks with shouts and rifle butts, formed into columns of 500, and marched toward the main gate under heavy guard. The weak were separated immediately, herded toward the eastern edge of the camp where a large pit had been dug during the night. The sound of machine gun fire echoed across the compound at irregular intervals throughout the morning, each burst announcing another group eliminated. The professor stood at his post near the gate, watching the columns shuffle past, their faces empty of everything except the mechanical will to place one foot in front of the other. The guards had been ordered to shoot anyone who fell, anyone who slowed, anyone who broke formation. The road west would be marked by bodies. Everyone knew it. The prisoners knew it. The guards knew it. And in the knowing, a strange understanding passed between captor and captive. This was the end of something, and both sides were simply trying to survive until it finished. The first column departed at 800 hours, disappearing down the forest road in a cloud of dust and despair. The second followed an hour later. The professor had been reassigned from tower duty to march security, a position that placed him on the outer flank of the column with 3 other guards. This was the opportunity his small conspiracy had been waiting for. On the road, away from the camp's command structure, individual guards would have moments of isolation where choices could be made without immediate oversight. The march route took them through dense pine forests that pressed close to the narrow dirt road, terrain that offered cover for anyone quick enough and brave enough to make a run for it. The plan, discussed in hurried whispers during the previous night, was simple. When the column entered the deepest section of forest, the guards who had agreed to help would position themselves at specific points. They would create gaps in the security perimeter. They would delay raising alarms. They would give prisoners a chance to vanish into the trees. It was not a guarantee of survival. The forest was vast and dangerous, filled with Wehrmacht stragglers, SS patrols, and desperate civilians fleeing the Soviet advance. But it was a chance, and for men facing certain death on the march, a chance was everything. The column moved slowly, limited by the pace of the weakest prisoners, who somehow still had the strength to walk. The professor positioned himself on the left flank, approximately 50 meters from the nearest guard. The forest grew thicker as they moved deeper into the morning, the canopy overhead blocking out the spring sunlight and casting the road in perpetual twilight. He could feel the tension in the column, the way certain prisoners began to drift toward the edges, testing the boundaries of what they could get away with. These were the strong ones, the survivors who had made it through years of captivity by being smarter and quicker than those who died. They sensed the opportunity before anyone spoke of it. They saw the gaps between guards, noticed the way the professor kept his rifle pointed down rather than at the ready position. One prisoner, a Polish man with the hardened face of someone who had fought in the underground, made eye contact with the professor. It was a question and a challenge. The professor responded by deliberately looking away, focusing his attention on the trees to his right, while the Pole drifted further left. The first escape happened so smoothly, it seemed almost rehearsed. The Pole simply stepped off the road and into the undergrowth, his grey prison uniform blending with the shadows. The professor counted to 30 before he turned, saw the empty space where a prisoner should have been, and raised his rifle to fire a warning shot into the air. The blast echoed through the forest, and the column halted immediately. Other guards rushed to the professor's position, shouting questions. He explained that a prisoner had attempted escape, but had disappeared into the thick brush. The guards discussed whether to pursue, but the senior officer in charge of the column made the pragmatic decision. Chasing one man into the forest would slow the entire march. They would report the escape and continue. The column moved forward, and in that moment, something shifted. Other prisoners had seen what happened. They had seen the delay, the lack of pursuit, the deliberate inefficiency of the response. Within the hour, 3 more men slipped away from the column at different points. Each time the alarm came late. Each time the search was perfunctory. Each time the march continued without the missing prisoners being recovered. By midday, the column had lost 23 men to the forest. The senior officer was beginning to suspect sabotage, his suspicions falling on the guards who seemed least effective at preventing escapes. But the chaos of the march made investigation impossible. Prisoners were collapsing from exhaustion, requiring guards to stop and shoot them where they fell. The forest road narrowed in places, forcing the column to bunch up and creating exactly the kind of confusion that made security impossible. The professor continued his performance of competent incompetence, responding to escapes just slowly enough to allow them to succeed while maintaining the appearance of diligence. He was walking a razor's edge. Too many escapes on his watch would bring immediate execution. Too few would make him complicit in the massacre he was trying to prevent. He calculated each decision with the cold mathematics of survival, weighing lives against timing, mercy against self-preservation. And with each prisoner who vanished into the trees, he felt the weight on his soul shift incrementally, a small counterbalance to the young man he had shot in front of the Gestapo investigator. The march continued for 3 days through terrain that grew progressively more difficult as they moved deeper into territory contested by advancing Soviet forces. The column encountered refugees fleeing east, Wehrmacht units retreating in disorder, and occasional pockets of SS fanatics who screamed about fighting to the last man. The guards were exhausted, sleeping in shifts during brief stops, subsisting on whatever rations they had packed and whatever they could scavenge from abandoned farms. The prisoners were beyond exhaustion, operating in a state of mechanical survival where consciousness itself seemed negotiable. More died on the road than escaped into the forest. Bodies lined the route like grotesque mile markers, shot where they fell and left for the crows. The professor lost count after the first 100. His moral accounting system, the careful balance sheet he had maintained between lives saved and lives taken, collapsed under the sheer scale of death. He continued to create opportunities for escape whenever possible, but the opportunities grew fewer as the guards became more paranoid and the prisoners became too weak to run. On the 4th night, the column made camp in a clearing beside a stream swollen with spring melt. The senior officer, a captain named Holtz, who had served on the Eastern Front before a shell fragment took his right eye, gathered the guards for a briefing. Soviet reconnaissance units had been spotted less than 10 kilometers to the east. The Red Army's main advance was perhaps a day behind. The decision had been made to abandon the march and surrender to advancing American forces believed to be somewhere to the west. The prisoners would be released. The guards would dispose of their weapons and attempt to blend into the civilian population. It was every man for himself. The captain's words hung in the cold air like a confession of ultimate defeat. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years was dissolving after 12, and the men who had served it were being cut loose to face whatever judgment awaited them. Some guards wept. Others sat in stunned silence. A few simply walked away into the darkness, deserting into a landscape that no longer had clear lines between captor and captive, soldier and civilian, guilt and innocence. The professor sat apart from the others, his back against a pine tree, and stared at the prisoners huddled around small fires in the clearing. They were almost too weak to comprehend what the captain had announced. Freedom was coming, but for many, it would arrive too late. Their bodies had been pushed beyond the point where recovery was possible. They would die as free men, but they would still die. He thought about the 3 Polish resistance fighters who had escaped that frozen night in winter, the ones he had helped by turning his searchlight away. They were probably alive somewhere, had probably made it to Soviet lines or joined partisan units. His single act of mercy had multiplied into 3 continued lives, 3 futures that would branch and grow and touch other lives in ways he would never know. But against that calculus stood all the deaths he had witnessed, all the times he had not acted, all the compromises he had made to survive. The mathematics of morality offered no clear answer. He had saved some and failed to save many more. He had killed at least one and stood by while hundreds died. What did that make him? A hero? A collaborator? Or simply a man trying to maintain his humanity in a system designed to destroy it? The guards began deserting in earnest once darkness fully settled. They stripped off their uniforms, burned their identification papers, and disappeared into the forest in 2s and 3s. By midnight, fewer than 20 guards remained with nearly 400 prisoners. The professor stayed at his post, understanding that his presence still mattered. Some of the younger guards, the fanatics who still believed in fighting to the end, were talking about executing the prisoners before the Soviets arrived. They argued it would be a mercy compared to what Soviet revenge would bring. The professor positioned himself between these guards and the prisoners, his rifle now pointed at his former comrades. He was not alone. The farmer from Saxony stood beside him. So did the police officer from Hamburg. They did not speak. They simply made clear through their stance that no more killing would happen on this night. The fanatics backed down, realizing they were outnumbered by men who had nothing left to lose, and no more capacity for murder. They melted into the forest, taking their ideology and their weapons with them, leaving behind only the echo of what they had been. Dawn broke over a clearing filled with the living and the dying. Guards and prisoners mixed together in the exhaustion that transcends category. Soviet advance scouts arrived first, young soldiers with machine pistols who approached cautiously, expecting resistance or a trap. Instead, they found a scene that defied simple narrative. Guards without weapons sitting beside prisoners, too weak to move. Men in Wehrmacht uniforms sharing water with men in striped prison garb. The Soviets did not know what to make of it. They separated the guards from the prisoners, prepared to execute the guards immediately as camp personnel. The prisoners, those strong enough to speak, intervened. They explained that some guards had helped them escape, that some had refused to kill when ordered, that some had protected them at the end. The Soviet officer listened with cold skepticism, but ultimately made a pragmatic decision. The guards would be taken as prisoners of war rather than executed on the spot. It was not justice, but it was not summary execution either. The professor surrendered his rifle, allowed himself to be bound, and was marched away with the other surviving guards toward an uncertain fate. The Soviet prisoner of war camp was located in what had once been a German military barracks outside Dresden, now transformed into a holding facility for the thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers captured during the final collapse. The professor arrived there in late April of 1945, part of a column of exhausted men who had been marched for a week through the smoking ruins of the Reich. The conditions were brutal, but not deliberately cruel. Food was scarce for everyone in the chaos of immediate post-war Europe. Medical care was minimal. Interrogations were frequent and often violent. The Soviets were hunting for SS officers, Gestapo agents, and anyone connected to the concentration camp system. The professor's service record identified him as a labor camp guard, which placed him in a category of particular interest. He was separated from the general prisoner population and placed in a special barracks reserved for men awaiting investigation. He knew what investigation meant. It meant determining whether he should face trial for war crimes or simply be shipped to Siberia to die slowly in the Gulag system that mirrored the camps he had helped administer. The interrogations began within days of his arrival. A Soviet military intelligence officer, a major who spoke fluent German and had the dead eyes of someone who had seen too much suffering to care about adding to it, questioned him for hours about his service. What camp had he worked at? What were his duties? How many prisoners had been killed during his watch? Had he personally executed anyone? Had he participated in selections? The professor answered truthfully, understanding that lies would only worsen his situation. He described his role as a tower guard, admitted to shooting the prisoner who had attempted escape under Gestapo observation, explained the evacuation march and the final days in the forest. What he did not mention were the escapes he had enabled. That information felt too dangerous, too likely to be dismissed as a desperate attempt to fabricate exculpatory evidence. The interrogator listened without expression, taking meticulous notes, occasionally asking for clarification on dates or locations. At the end of the third session, he asked a question that cut through all the careful documentation. He asked whether the professor believed he was guilty of crimes. The answer came without hesitation. Yes, not for what he had done, but for what he had failed to do. For every time he had followed orders when he could have resisted. For every death he had witnessed without acting. Guilt was not a legal category. It was a moral reality that would follow him regardless of what any tribunal decided. Weeks passed in the liminal space of captivity, where time moved slowly and the future remained completely opaque. Rumors circulated constantly through the barracks. Some said all camp guards would be hanged. Others claimed only SS officers would face execution. A few whispered that the Soviets were simply waiting for the Americans and British to lose interest before shipping everyone east to the labor camps. The professor spent his days in a strange state of suspension, neither hoping for nor fearing whatever judgment awaited him. He had made his choices. He had saved some lives and failed to save others. Whatever came next was simply the consequence of having existed in a moral catastrophe. He thought often about the 3 Polish resistance fighters, wondering if they had survived the war, if they had returned to whatever homes remained in the rubble of Poland. He thought about the young man he had shot, whose life he had tried to preserve with careful aim, but who had died anyway in a camp infirmary. He thought about the prisoners who had escaped during the death march, and about those who had died on the road because he had not acted quickly enough or boldly enough to save them. Memory became both punishment and redemption, a constant recitation of accounts that would never balance. In June, something unexpected happened. A Polish liaison officer arrived at the camp, part of a joint Allied commission investigating war crimes. He carried with him a list of names provided by survivors, Germans who had aided prisoners or shown mercy in circumstances where mercy was death. The professor's name was not on the list. He had never known his name would be recorded, but a description matched him closely enough to prompt an interview. The former teacher from Bavaria with a limp, the tower guard who had turned his searchlight away on a winter night, the march guard who had been slow to respond to escapes. 3 separate survivors had independently mentioned him in their depositions. The Polish officer sat across from the professor in a small interview room and asked a single question. Why had he done it? Why had he risked everything to help prisoners escape when the entire system incentivized cruelty and punished mercy? The professor struggled to articulate an answer that made sense even to himself. He spoke about the teacher he had been before the war, about the belief that education could elevate people above their worst impulses. He talked about watching that belief die in the camps, about the slow realization that orders and uniforms could transform ordinary men into instruments of atrocity. And he explained that turning the searchlight away had been an attempt to prove to himself that some part of who he had been still existed beneath the uniform. It was not heroism. It was desperation to maintain a connection to his humanity when everything around him was designed to sever that connection. The Polish officer listened in silence, then closed his notebook and stood to leave. Before departing, he said something that would echo through the professor's remaining years. He said that moral choices made under extreme duress do not erase guilt, but they do matter. They matter to the people who survive because of them. They matter as evidence that even in systems designed to eliminate choice, individuals can still choose. And they matter as proof that the capacity for mercy does not die easily, even when everything conspires to kill it. The professor would not learn until months later that the Polish officer's testimony helped prevent his deportation to the Gulag. He would not know until years after that one of the 3 resistance fighters he had helped escape had become a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials and had quietly intervened on his behalf. All he knew in that moment was that someone had borne witness to his choices, and that witness had been deemed sufficient to shift the scales of judgment, however slightly, in a direction other than damnation. The professor was released from Soviet custody in October of 1946, part of a general repatriation of low-level Wehrmacht prisoners deemed not to pose significant security threats. He returned to Bavaria to find his hometown transformed by destruction and occupation. The school where he had taught literature to idealistic young men no longer existed, reduced to rubble during an Allied bombing raid in the final months of the war. His small apartment had been requisitioned by American forces and was now home to a military administration office. His wife, from whom he had been separated since his conscription, had died during the chaos of the Reich's collapse, killed by a stray artillery shell while standing in a bread line. He learned this from a neighbor who barely recognized him, who looked at his gaunt frame and hollow eyes and asked what camp he had been in. When he explained he had been a guard rather than a prisoner, the neighbor's expression changed instantly from sympathy to contempt. The conversation ended, the door closed, and the professor understood that he was returning not to a home, but to a society that would forever see him as complicit in crimes too enormous to forgive. He found work as a laborer, loading debris from bombed buildings onto trucks bound for disposal sites. It was brutal physical work that his injured leg made agonizing, but it was all that was available to a man whose service record marked him as untouchable. The other workers avoided him once they learned he had been a camp guard. During breaks, they ate together in groups that deliberately excluded him. No one spat on him or attacked him, but the isolation was absolute. He existed in a social void, neither condemned enough to be imprisoned nor innocent enough to be accepted. The American occupation authorities required all former camp personnel to register and submit to denazification proceedings, a bureaucratic process designed to categorize guilt into convenient administrative categories. The professor was classified as a follower rather than an activist, someone who had served the regime without evident enthusiasm. His sentence was a fine he could not pay and a prohibition from teaching that made his former profession permanently inaccessible. He appealed the decision, citing the testimony from the Polish officer and the evidence of prisoners he had helped. The appeals board acknowledged his actions, but ruled that they did not constitute sufficient grounds for exoneration. He had still served in the camp system. He had still worn the uniform. He had still participated in a machinery of death. Mitigation was not innocence. Years passed in a grey monotony broken only by the occasional letter from survivor organizations seeking testimony for ongoing war crimes trials. The professor responded to every request, providing detailed accounts of camp operations, guard rotations, selection procedures, and the names of officers who had enthusiastically embraced their roles as executioners. His testimony helped convict 3 SS officers and 2 camp commandants. He took no satisfaction from these convictions, understanding that justice for such crimes was impossible. You could not balance the scales when one side held millions of dead. You could only document the machinery and punish some of its operators. He never mentioned his own acts of mercy in these testimonies, believing they were irrelevant to the larger accounting. Only once did a prosecutor specifically ask him about the night he had turned the searchlight away. The question came during a trial in 1952, 7 years after the war's end. The prosecutor wanted to know why he had done it, what had prompted that specific decision on that specific night. The professor gave the same answer he had given to the Polish officer. He had needed to prove to himself that he was still capable of choosing mercy. The prosecutor nodded and moved on to other questions. The moment passed without further comment. In 1958, the professor received a letter with a Warsaw postmark. It was from one of the 3 Polish resistance fighters he had helped escape, a man named Jankowski, who had survived the war and become an engineer in the rebuilding of Poland. The letter was brief and formal, written in careful German that suggested multiple drafts. Jankowski explained that he had spent years trying to locate the guard who had saved his life, working through Red Cross records and survivor networks until he finally found a name and an address. He wrote that he wanted the professor to know that his act had mattered. That because of those 43 seconds when the searchlight turned away, Jankowski had lived to see his country liberated, to marry, to have children, to contribute to building something better from the ruins. He wrote that he understood the professor had also suffered, that choosing mercy in that system had carried costs that could never be repaid. He ended the letter with a single sentence that would become the professor's anchor in the decades that followed. He wrote that witnesses to grace have an obligation to testify and that Jankowski would bear witness to the professor's choice for as long as he lived. The professor kept that letter in his pocket for the rest of his life, the paper eventually becoming soft and fragile from constant folding and unfolding. He never responded to it, feeling that his own words would be inadequate to the weight of what Jankowski had offered. But he carried it through the remaining years of his exile from normalcy, through the slow reconstruction of Germany that never quite reconstructed his place within it, through the decades when the war receded from immediate memory into history. The letter was a single piece of evidence that his choice had created consequences beyond his knowledge, that the 3 lives he had saved had branched into families and futures he would never meet. It was not redemption. Nothing could redeem the scale of what he had witnessed and failed to prevent. But it was proof that even in the machinery of annihilation, individual choices could still generate life rather than death. That in turning a searchlight away for 43 seconds, a man could create a future he would never inhabit, but had nonetheless made possible. The professor died in 1973 at the age of 62, his body worn out by years of manual labor and the accumulated weight of memories that never softened with time. He collapsed while working at a construction site in Munich, his damaged leg finally giving out beneath him as he carried a load of bricks up a scaffold. The death certificate listed heart failure as the cause, but those who had known him understood it was something more complex. A heart can fail from many things, and prolonged moral exhaustion is as deadly as any disease. He was buried in a small municipal cemetery on the outskirts of the city, attended by exactly 3 people: a priest who had never met him but performed the service out of professional obligation, a former co-worker who felt someone should be present, and an elderly man who traveled from Warsaw despite failing health, who stood at the graveside with tears streaming down his face and who placed a small stone on the fresh earth in accordance with the tradition the professor would have recognized from his teaching days when he had lectured about Jewish customs and European literature. Jankowski had come to bear witness one final time, to ensure that the man who had saved his life would not pass from the world completely unacknowledged. The professor left behind almost nothing of material value. His small apartment contained a narrow bed, a single chair, a hot plate for cooking, and 3 boxes of books that had survived the war. There were no photographs, no personal correspondence except for Jankowski's letter, no diary or memoir documenting his experiences. He had chosen silence as his mode of existence, believing that men who had served in the camps had forfeited the right to tell their own stories. The books were donated to a local library that processed them as anonymous contributions. The furniture was disposed of by the building superintendent. The apartment was cleaned and prepared for the next tenant within a week of his death. It was as if he had never existed, his life erased as thoroughly as the Reich he had served and survived. But erasure is never complete. Memory persists in unexpected places, carried by people who refuse to let certain truths disappear. Jankowski returned to Warsaw and wrote a detailed account of the professor's action, depositing it with Yad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial in Jerusalem. The testimony sat in archives for decades, one document among millions, waiting for someone to discover it. In 1998, a graduate student researching the death marches of 1945, stumbled across Jankowski's testimony while conducting archival research. The story of the guard who turned his searchlight away appeared in a footnote in her dissertation, 3 sentences in a work of 500 pages. Those 3 sentences caught the attention of a documentary filmmaker who was producing a series on moral choices during the Holocaust. The filmmaker tracked down 2 of the prisoners who had escaped during the death march, both of whom were still alive and living in Israel. Their testimonies corroborated and expanded the story. They described the professor's careful incompetence, his deliberate delays in responding to escapes, his positioning of himself between fanatic guards and prisoners during the final night. One man remembered that the professor had shared his rations with prisoners during the march, an act of kindness that seemed impossibly small against the scale of suffering, but had meant the difference between survival and collapse for several men who made it to liberation. The documentary aired in 2001 on German public television, 56 years after the war's end. It included interviews with survivors, historical footage of the camps, and a dramatic reenactment of the night the searchlight turned away. The professor was not named in the documentary because his identity had been lost to time, known only through description and the testimony of men who had never learned his name. He was referred to simply as the guard who chose mercy, a phrase that became the title of the 15-minute segment. The broadcast generated significant discussion in Germany about the complexity of guilt and complicity, about the difference between active perpetrators and those who had been conscripted into evil, about whether small acts of resistance within a totalitarian system deserved recognition, or whether such recognition minimized the larger crimes. The debate was passionate and unresolved, as all debates about moral complexity and absolute evil must be. But buried within the academic discussions and public arguments was a simple truth that the survivors understood, even if the scholars struggled with it. The professor had made a choice that created life instead of death. In a system designed to eliminate choice, that act of defiance mattered. Jankowski died in 2003 at the age of 84, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, in the apartment he had lived in since returning to Warsaw after the war. His final words, translated from Polish by his daughter, were a question about whether anyone had ever found the professor's name. When told that the identity remained unknown, he nodded with what his family described as profound sadness. He wanted the name to be remembered, wanted the man who had given him 43 seconds of grace to be acknowledged as more than an anonymous functionary in a monstrous system. But memory is a fragile thing, subject to the accidents of survival and the choices about what we preserve. The professor had chosen erasure, had deliberately left no record, had believed his guilt was too great to deserve memorialization. Jankowski had chosen testimony, had insisted on bearing witness, had fought to ensure the story survived even when the name did not. Both choices were acts of moral seriousness, different responses to the same question about how to live with the weight of history. And both choices shaped how the story would be remembered and forgotten, discovered and lost in the decades that followed. Today, more than 80 years after that winter night when a searchlight turned deliberately away, the professor's story exists in a strange liminal space between memory and oblivion. His name is gone, erased by his own choice and the chaos of war's end. But his action persists, carried forward through the testimonies of survivors, through academic footnotes, through documentary films, and now through this telling. The 3 Polish resistance fighters he helped escape that first night generated descendants who number in the dozens. Jankowski alone had 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and at the time of this recording, 17 great-grandchildren. Each of those lives represents a future that would not exist without 43 seconds of courage in the darkness. The mathematics of mercy operate on scales we cannot fully comprehend. One choice made in a moment of moral clarity within a system designed to eliminate morality cascades through generations in ways that can never be fully calculated. The professor died believing he had failed more than he had succeeded, that his guilt outweighed his grace. But the ledger he kept was incomplete because he could not see the futures he had made possible. The story of the guard who turned his searchlight away challenges our comfortable narratives about good and evil during the Holocaust. We prefer our heroes pure and our villains absolute, because complexity is uncomfortable and ambiguity feels like moral relativism. But history is not a morality play with clear costumes designating the righteous from the damned. The professor wore a Wehrmacht uniform. He carried a weapon. He served in the camp system. By any reasonable definition, he was complicit in crimes against humanity. Yet within that complicity, he found space for resistance. He used the tools of oppression to create opportunities for escape. He transformed the searchlight meant to imprison into a beacon that guided men to freedom. This paradox, this existence of mercy within machinery of death, is what makes his story important. It demonstrates that even in the most totalitarian systems, even when the costs of resistance seem overwhelming, individuals retain the capacity to choose. That capacity is not unlimited. It does not erase guilt, but it exists and it matters. The professor's story was nearly lost because he chose silence and because the mechanisms of historical memory favor the dramatic over the subtle, the named over the anonymous, the documented over the whispered. How many other stories like his have disappeared completely, carried to graves by men and women who believed their small acts of resistance were too insignificant to record or too compromised by their larger complicity to deserve remembrance? We will never know the full count of searchlights turned away, of documents filed incorrectly, of warnings delivered early, of rations shared, of blind eyes strategically deployed. These acts leave few traces in the historical record. They are not battles or speeches or manifestos. They are individual choices made in moments of crisis, witnessed by few, and often deliberately concealed. Yet they represent something essential about human moral capacity. They prove that the banality of evil, which Hannah Arendt so brilliantly identified, does not preclude the possibility of quiet resistance. Ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances can still choose mercy, even when the system punishes mercy and rewards cruelty. The erasure of the professor's name carries its own message about memory and guilt in post-war Germany. He chose anonymity not from modesty but from shame, believing that men who had worn the uniform had forfeited the right to be remembered as anything other than perpetrators. This impulse towards self-erasure was common among Germans who had served in compromised positions, who had witnessed atrocities without stopping them, who had made occasional choices for mercy while participating in a system of murder. They did not see themselves as heroes because they understood the scale of what they had failed to prevent. The professor's refusal to claim recognition for his acts of resistance was itself a form of moral seriousness, an acknowledgement that personal redemption was not possible when set against collective guilt. But that choice, multiplied across thousands of individuals, created a gap in historical memory. It allowed the narrative of the Holocaust to be divided into clear categories of perpetrators and victims, eliminating the messy middle ground where most people actually existed. The result is a history that is morally satisfying but incomplete, that tells us less than we need to know about how ordinary people navigate extraordinary evil. If you found value in this story, in this recovery of a nearly lost piece of history, I ask you to do something the professor never did. Do not choose erasure. Share this story. Ensure that this act of mercy, anonymous though it must remain, continues to exist in collective memory. The professor believed his name should disappear, but the survivors who bore witness believed the action should endure. They were right. In a world that still struggles with authoritarianism, with systems that demand complicity, with the constant pressure to follow orders and avoid moral complexity, we need stories like this. We need to know that searchlights can be turned away, that individuals can resist even when resistance seems impossible, that small acts of courage in the face of overwhelming evil are not futile gestures but essential affirmations of human dignity. The professor died in obscurity, believing he had failed. But Jankowski traveled across Europe to stand at his grave and bear witness. That witness, passed through decades and across continents, now reaches you. What you do with it determines whether the story lives or dies. History is not just what happened. It is what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. This story, this moment of grace in the darkness, deserves to be remembered.